Today I talked to Dr. Mark McDonald. He is certified in both child, adolescent, and adult psychiatry with an extensive additional training in adult psychoanalysis. He is famous for writing two books. One of them is called The United States of Fear, and it's about mass delusional psychosis that happened during the time period of COVID 2020, 2021. And then he wrote a second book called Freedom from Fear, and it's a 12-step program to help people that he thinks are fear addicted. He's also a very intelligent human being who speaks multiple languages. He speaks French, Japanese, and Spanish. And we had a fun conversation, and we did not agree on a lot of things, and we agreed on a lot of things. And the foundation of the conversation is that we both agree that the freedom of speech should always be the first priority, and that freedom itself is something that we should all strive to maintain. It was a fun conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Don't forget to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and it's going to be on Rumble. Enjoy the episode.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
Dr. Mark McDonald, thank you for joining me this morning.
Good morning, Ryan.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. I have been listening to a lot of your ideas for a couple of years now, and I love the books you've written. The United States of Fear, and it's about mass delusional psychosis, and that's a very interesting subject that we can get into, as well as Freedom from Fear, your second book, and it's about fear of addiction to fear, and how to get away from that with a 12-step program, which is pretty amazing to hear you articulate. So you stay pretty busy from what I've gathered. It looks like you are a psychiatrist for children, for adolescents, and for adults, and it looks like you practice Aikido, Jiu-Jitsu, Krav Maga. You speak multiple languages. You speak French, Japanese, and Spanish. So you stay very busy from what I've gathered.
Not all at once. This is a history, so I can't do all of that at the same time. But yes, over a number of years, I've dabbled in all of those different pursuits, and have found all of them to be very helpful at different times in my life.
It's awesome. I can definitely respect that. You stay busy. Well, I'd love to get into your second book first, if you don't mind, just because I think I'd love to get into both of them. But I'd love to know what drove you to write that second book. It obviously seems like fear is the underlying subject, and that it's been used as a mechanism to distract people and to control people in a certain way. And it seems to be working quite well, as we've seen in the last 4 years. So I'd love to hear about that.
So I wrote my second book, Freedom from Fear, in response to the questions that I was getting from really everyone around me, my patients, audience members when I would go to speak, people who read my book, people who were reading my blog, podcast. And the question really was, okay, now we know what's going on. It's 2022 now. We get it. We realize that we've been had, we've been lied to, we've been controlled. So what do we do? Meaning my friends and family is what they meant by we, because these are people that already had an idea of what was going on from the beginning and how to immunize themselves to the fear mongering. And the question was, what do we do for our friends and family who are still stuck in this fear mode? And I conceptualized it as an addiction. I said it's really very similar to smoking cigarettes or gambling. You get into a habit because it feels good in the moment, and then over time it starts to wreck your life. And a lot of people that I know, and still know actually, are truly addicted to fear. They've become conditioned to worship at this altar of safety rather than of adventure, exploration, spontaneity, taking risks, which is necessary to lead a full and complete life. And they don't know what to do with themselves. And so a lot of people who care about them and want to help them came to me and still come to me and asked me, what do we do for these people? And so I wrote the book in answer to that question. It's not a polemic on all of the evils of society, which is really what the first book was. It's more of a me to you didactic teaching book. It's not emotionally inciting. It's provocative in the sense that I'm challenging people to try to confront some of their addictions in the same way that you would in a 12-step program. And I start with this book opening with the request that you, in order to overcome your addiction, you must acknowledge that you have one. And that's where I start, and then I continue from there.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's perfect because our culture seems to be really promoting victimhood and trying to remove adversity from our school systems and from the child's mind, and even adults. I've noticed it in the last probably 10 years, but more in the last 5 years. It just seems like everybody wants to coddle everybody and not really speak about the truth. And I noticed a lot of the underlying tones that you had were to face yourself in the mirror and to tell the truth, acknowledge the truth. And a lot of people just don't want to because it's uncomfortable. And it's also being somewhat of the feedback loop that they get from our culture is to avoid it and to not tell the truth because of political correctness or censorship or whatever it is, virtue signaling. So I'd like to get into some of the elements that you've seen that you wrote about in that 12-step program.
Well, one of them that I think is very important is to, as I say in the book, to drop the dealer. There are dealers of fear, just like there's dealers of drugs and dealers of envy and jealousy and attacks on one's self-confidence on social media, which is what girls are very prone to. And I think that the dealers of fear have largely been the media. There are allegiances and alliances, often really nefarious ones, between our major media outlets, both print and video and news media, and our governments, our corporations that we all know now, really beyond any doubt, we're all complicit in lying to us in concert for an entire year in 2020 and then moving on. They're still lying to us, but it's just harder because people are now a little bit wise to it. And those that seem to be stuck in this fear cycle, they seem largely to me to be constantly going back to this drug dealer of fear. They're reading the New York Times, they're watching MSNBC and ABC, they're subscribing to push notifications on their phone from sources that are constantly telling them that they need to be afraid. And in any type of good addiction treatment program, you go through a detox. You just cut it all off. You don't cut down on your alcohol. You just decide, I don't want to drink anymore. And then you avoid bars. You don't walk past them on your way home from work. You don't go to friends' houses that are likely to involve drinking. You build up your resilience to the fear mongering so that when you dive back in areas that you really have to be in, like let's say you go to a larger party where you know alcohol's being served, but you have options, you'll be able to say no to the drug. But it's very hard to do that right away at the beginning because you're so conditioned. You walk down the street and as soon as you see someone off in the distance, you reach in your pocket, you pull out a mask and you stick it on your face. That's conditioning. And then when the person passes by, you take it off, you put it back in your pocket. It's very difficult to overcome those sorts of reactive learned behaviors unless you cut off the fuel that feeds them. That's one of the most important steps, I think. And it's one of the hardest because we live in, most of us anyway, in these urban societies where everywhere we go, in most cities in the US, we're told to be afraid. We hear it on the radio. We hear it from our friends, people that we work with. So you have to find out how you can cut these people and these sources off, at least temporarily, so that you can do a reset and you can actually get back to a reality check so that when you do go out and you do make decisions on what you're going to do, it comes from a place of more, I would say, more objectivity and less emotionality.
I love that. I'm sure a lot of people go through that withdrawal phase too when they start to do that. And I've noticed a lot of the fear is just really fear of what people think. And it becomes this virtue signaling game when it comes to whatever. It could be masking, it could be a political standpoint. And it's like a lot of people just jump on board, but privately they think completely different. But outwardly in the workspace or in the school zones or wherever it's at, we're sort of groomed or punished if we don't groupthink. And a lot of the colleges now, and even in the younger educational programs, kids are not allowed to question authority or to have different answers. They're punished. And I think that's dangerous. And I know I've heard you speak to that. I think it's terrible.
It's happening right now. I mean, even after the election, where it's been made clear that a majority of Americans of all political parties, religious faiths, sexual orientations, races, ages, sexes, all want a back to normal. We want to go back to basics. I think that was really the message, generally speaking, in the election. And you're still hearing about it even now from students in schools that are being banned from celebrating the revolution that occurred this November in the federal and state and local elections. They're being told what to think. They're being told what is good think, what is bad think. And this is in our government school system. It's still happening. It's happening everywhere. You can't really escape it. Children, one of my big movements personally and in my clinical practice is to protect children from trans ideology, trans activism. And children are being told by their teachers, their therapists, their club supervisors that they can and should explore other sexual gender identities. This is really wrong. Children are very pliable. They're very amenable to adult influence. And to the best of our ability, we should provide them with critical thinking skills, objective, basic information like how to read, how to write, how to count, and instill in them a sense of civic virtue and patriotism for the country. We should not be ever injecting them with ideological BS. This is wrong. It's been going on now for a number of years. It's already taken over the universities, and now it's taking over the primary education, not even just K through 12, even into nursery schools. If we don't address this as a nation to help clean out the minds of children so that they can actually make decisions for themselves, then I think we're going to lose this next generation. And I think this is really the objective, actually, of, for lack of a better word, the left, which is kind of a coalition of corporatist, globalists, anti-family, anti-religious zealots that want to take over our society. And they know they can't really do that by taking over the adults because there's too many adults who are wise to them. But if they take over the children, and then the children move into positions of power, eventually they'll push the adults out, and then basically the left will have won.
I agree. Did you ever listen to that KGB defector that spoke about, the 1984 talk where he was saying how long it takes to demoralize a whole culture? It takes 20 years. And that seems to be what I've gathered from COVID, a big part of what's happened. And I was curious what your thoughts were as far as where is the underlying mechanism coming from? Is it some sort of communist takeover that's infiltrated our country from post-World War II? Our CIA was somewhat involved with that. It's a very deep and interesting underlying problem. And it's in all aspects of our culture, our education systems, our entertainment industries. And we can all see it. Most people can see it now. And that's why this election was so important. Like if you listen to Elon Musk on Joe Rogan and other platforms, he speaks to it really well. But no one ever seems to point out the beginning phase of where this started. And I was curious what your thoughts were on where it's coming from.
That's a really difficult question to answer because I think when you go back further and further, you see these antecedents that way precede the 2020 Wuhan virus pandemic propaganda campaign. And that's what I wrote about in my first book, United States of Fear, was that it's very clear that this movement, and I would call it like James Lindsay says, it's a kind of a corporatist globalist Marxism movement that seeks to dismantle modern society and cede power to a small group of select elites. It really began after the Second World War, clearly, but I have read and heard examples that you could argue have planted the seeds way before that. But I just find it harder to trace once you go pre-World War II because there isn't, in my view, this is my opinion, I don't see any organized conspiracy before that time. I see pieces. I mean, Lenin came to power in the early 1900s, and that communist movement, you could say, is really the seed of everything. But it didn't infiltrate into the United States in any significant degree before World War II. We did have isolated communist cells, but it was a very fringy political movement. It wasn't in our corporations. It wasn't really in our government to any large degree, certainly in Hollywood. I think after the Second World War, where you can see these large-scale social movements, like feminism, for example, is a very important part of this anti-man movement, which is really all that feminism, post-war feminism is. It doesn't care for women at all. the movement, the Lyndon Johnson movement, the Great Society program, essentially reestablishing the role of government as the father figure, the one who takes care of us, rather than the family and the community, which began really social welfare, which led to the devastation of the American Black community. That is the primary cause of the current devastation of Black Americans, which were, as a community, largely better off in terms of safety, two-parent households, church-goingness, all facets of life, really, even their economic power, their wages were better before welfare began. The unions that built up in the early 1900s were primarily designed to keep out minority workers, not to protect the rights of the existing workers. It was to create a wage threshold that no one without already inherent access and skills could pierce. And that includes a lot of Blacks who needed those lower wage jobs to gain skills and move up the ladder. It's basically taking the ladder up after getting into the castle and just leaving everybody out to die. That's the function of unions. So you see these groups that formed, and these are all somewhat political groups, but they're originally socially driven and built off of kind of cartel statuses. They all started to merge together in their objectives and decided that they would have really a group pass to crush the people beneath them because they thought they were better than everyone else. So I see it really less as a communist movement per se, and more as a purely elitist movement. I mean, communism is an elitist movement, but this is much broader. It's not based on just work and class. It's based on a lot more. It's much more global. It's international, and it goes way beyond class. And it creates victim classes and groups that lead to tribalism, which is another mechanism that is very common and very, very powerful today to try to distract people from their own ills. When you create victim classes, it diverts attention away from actually who's suffering. Blacks and women and children are all suffering today from these so-called pro-woman, pro-Black, pro-child movements. And they're not actually. They use these groups to gain power for themselves, and then they destroy the people that they say that they're founded to represent.
Yeah, it seems so sophisticated the way I think of it as some sort of sophisticated viral spreading power. It just seems to me like there's people that understand the nature of human consciousness. And once you understand the social sciences and the behavioral sciences, they've taken a lot of that info, and then the big tech companies, and it just seems too well thought out. And that's the scariest part about it, is that it's been deployed in such a way that's working so well. We could see it in 2020. I don't think anybody was paying as much attention to it before then, but now it's just obvious, and which is good, because I think people are hip to it and they're feeling the emotional drive that comes from that. And I think things are swinging back the other way. And hopefully we can find a little balance in the next 4 or 5 years. But gosh, it sure is sophisticated the way it's been moving in the last 40 or 50 years.
I think it was a good thing, actually, looking back on it, not at the time, obviously, but looking back on it, that there wasn't a kind of ripping off of the Band-Aid 4 years ago in the previous election. I lived and have been living in a rather tense and not terribly fulfilling state the last 4 years because of all of the pressure and threats and dangers that don't cow me in any way, but they do objectively limit my ability to lead a full life. We don't have a free society right now, and when you don't have freedom, you're limited externally. I think that looking back on it, the fact that things got so much worse in the last 4 years, it allowed a larger group of Americans, a broader group of Americans, not just the so-called right-wing Christian conservative white people. Not that that was ever really true, but certainly way beyond what you consider a typical conservative. A majority of Americans now are completely, or semi-completely, certainly open enough to seeing that the groups and people and individuals that they believed were supporting them are not. And they have now banded together to create a new movement, which is not, I wouldn't even call it a conservative movement. Maybe populist would be a better word, but it's a very broad coalition of Americans who want to get back to normalcy, back to reality, so that we can then start arguing over the nitpicky details that we used to argue about in this country, which is fine. But we have to agree on some basic premises, and those have been tossed out the window certainly in the last 4 years. So I think the suffering we've endured may actually not be all for naught. It may actually have been the binder and the catalyst for this more sweeping, I would say almost revolutionary rather than evolutionary change that occurred in the last election. And I think that's the silver lining in all of this and all of the pain and suffering and loss that we've had to endure the last 4 years.
I agree. I like that view. And I think legacy media has shown that it's completely distrusted. And
Absolutely.
it's dead. I think this election with Twitter being bought by Elon and the podcast movement, I think it shows that for the next presidential elections, you're going to have to expose yourself on a 2 or 3 hour conversation so that we can know who you are and how you think. You can't hide anymore with these little puppet 30-second clips, sound bites. We need to know how you think. And whether you like how someone thinks or not, we should at least have the First Amendment protected, which is what we were losing so rapidly. I had Dr. McCullough on about a month ago, maybe a little more, and within 1 hour, hit that YouTube video was scrubbed from YouTube. And it's just algorithmic feedback loops that they've created with keywords to scrub the internet from anything that has to do with an agenda that's against theirs, to tell the truth. And it's so dangerous. It's like this authoritarian dictatorship that lives online through AI. And we do not want to go that direction, which is why I'm so happy to see this election with how the podcast movement, Twitter, that's probably why we're able to even go forward.
I think it's interesting you mentioned these new news sources or informative sources. I have a lot of friends and associates in Europe, and I have heard uniformly from these people that Europe monolithically is opposed to everything that we just voted into office, starting with Trump himself and then moving down into policies and positions. That is coming from a completely controlled, propagandistic, Pravda form of continental media. There is virtually no access in Europe unless you speak English and you go online and you go over to American news sources. And some people do, but it's not common. Like Joe Rogan, nobody knows Joe Rogan in Europe except expats and a very, very small number of populist Europeans, very small number who happen to have some ties to the US and want real information. So 90+% of Europe, the population, believes in the mission of the EU. They believe that Donald Trump is not only a bad man, but is actually going to start World War III in Europe. They truly believe this. And they believe this because all of their media tells them this. And they do not have any alternative media. We do. I know that it feels like we're being buried by propaganda, but we have far more options, relatively speaking, than Europe does. And that's why we were in the position to lead this revolution. I don't know if Europe can. I don't think they have enough information to enlighten a large enough percentage of the population to actually act. So I think we have to be grateful and also to show some perspective and not drown in this clutching of our pearls that somehow we have no way to get good information here in this country. I'm not saying it's easy, but we do have options. And that is an option for a future that many other countries really don't have realistically. And that's a good thing.
I agree. And I think the younger generation, I've been seeing more and more of it, the really younger generation, they're starting to really be tuned into this, and they're starting to really question authority and seek the truth. And they are not going to buy into legacy media. And so I think that's a really healthy thing, because it was getting pretty dangerously close during COVID, how many people got influenced to get the jab or lost their jobs. I almost lost my job as a firefighter for the mandate, and I wasn't going to ever get it. And I was going to lose a pension because of it. And it's unbelievable how many people, I think 70% of the population or something in America got jabbed. I'm not sure what the numbers were. Peter McCullough rattled them off, but we were going down a slippery slope there with the amount of information control. But then when you look at other countries, you're right. It's like they are in an echo chamber that's far beyond ours. And I think inside of Americans' blood, we do lead the world when it comes to driving for freedom. And I think that's the one thing that is in our DNA at this point. You know, we're the people that
Yes.
have abandoned authority and said we're going to go and create the freedom and build the Constitution and protect our rights and our religious freedoms. And so I'm excited to see what's going to happen, and I'm excited to be here. These types of things, like you said, when you allow fear, which is there for most people, to be your driving force, not to be something that we get buried by, but we look at it as opportunity. And I think that's what younger people need to start to pay attention to, because they're being taught to be victimized, and they're being taught to identify with their traumas and with their therapies. And I don't know if you've heard of that woman that wrote the book Bad Therapy. Have you heard of
I've heard
her?
of the book, but I haven't read it.
I've just heard her speak. I think she was on Joe Rogan and a couple other podcasts, but it was talking about these young people right now have had access to the most amount of therapy than any generation that's ever been alive. But they're the ones that are suffering from the most amount of PTSD and trauma and anxiety and depression. And it's because we're coddling and we're helping them to identify with these narratives that are probably being sold to them from the big pharma top down model, because it keeps you a permanent patient. And it's really dangerous.
The therapy model has really been hijacked by ideologues. I would say that 80% of my colleagues that I used to associate with, and many of whom I referred to for therapy, I've just tossed the Rolodex cards out in the trash because of explicit um, statements that they've made publicly about their approach to therapy, or my suspicions based upon sort of code words that they use. For example, putting in my pronouns are at the bottom of their email e-card. Anyone that does that is either complicit, pushing the trans agenda, or is just too cowardly to stand up to it. And therapists, good therapists, need to be courageous. They need to challenge false assumptions. That's sort of what therapy is about. It's not about holding the patient's hand and saying, there, you're a good person. That's what your girlfriends do at the coffee shop. That's not what the therapist does. The therapist is there, in my view, to hold a position of truth and reality with compassion for a patient who's suffering emotionally. And most of the therapists today aren't doing that. Most of them are actually going along with, co-opting the pathology of the patient, or even worse, injecting pathology into a patient who's got a pure suffering of, say, depression or anxiety, and then giving them an explanation for why that is, that's ideologically driven, which then leads to an angry victim. And it could lead to things much worse. It can lead to having a girl cut her breasts off, getting hormone injections, a boy cross-dressing, somebody who grows up with, let's say, just homosexual tendencies, a gay man, is now being told, well, it's not that you're gay, you actually want to be a woman, which is largely not true 99.99% of the time. So there's an attack on what I would call previously protected victim groups, like, say, gays, that's really horrific, by these groups that ostensibly are part of the LGBTQ community. But the T part of it is not part of the LGB. It's actually an attack on the LGB. So the therapy community, in my view, from my professional stance, my experience, is completely wrecked. I would not recommend in general that anybody go see a therapist today, unless it's a specific therapist that I personally know and can vouch for, because the odds are that if you go see a therapist, the odds are 8, 9 times out of 10, you will come out worse than you did when you went in. And that includes your children.
And the same thing is true for the colleges. You're going to pay a couple $100,000 and come back fully indoctrinated and basically dysfunctional and not able to deal with any adversity. It's almost like you're going out of your way and you're spending time and money to become worse off. And I feel like a lot of people are tuning into that as well. And I've known some guys at work that sent their kid to college and now they can't even have dinner together because there's so much righteousness and virtue that's tied to these ideas that are coming from their professors. And the professors can't let them get outside of that box, because then they don't get the grade to pass the course that they're paying money for. So it's like a giant echo chamber. It's really crazy.
universities were lost quite a while ago. They went downhill after the 60s peace protest, anti-Vietnam War movements, with the installation of left-wing, and I mean truly like communist-loving professors, and then the lowering of standards, the push with affirmative action to get minorities, ethnic and women, basically minorities, into universities, which then led to lowering of standards in order to get more in, which you see in the fire. I say firefighting. It's funny. I don't even call them firefighters. I call them firemen. I still call them stewardesses as well on the airplanes, because we didn't have women working in firefighting until the standards were lowered. I personally, I don't believe women should be allowed to be part of the profession that you were in, because it puts the lives of men and women at risk, because women cannot perform at the level that men can in lifting heavy objects and climbing poles and suffering smoke inhalation. They physically cannot do that. I have similar issues.
Some can. Very, very. It's just like anything. There's a few that can outwork me, but we shouldn't lower the standards. But there are some pretty badass chicks on the job.
I bet before the standards were lowered, the percentage was in the single digits. And now they're striving for 50-50 parity. And it's not possible to achieve that without lowering standards. Same thing with the military, same thing with the police force. And I think there's also a problem psychologically, even if there's a woman who has physical abilities that match the median of men, they're never going to match the best, which is why I'm opposed to it, because the strongest women are not going to beat the strongest men. And we should have the strongest of all groups within every field, whether it's sports or saving people's lives. But putting that aside, I have a problem with it psychologically, because good men, at least, are trained and primed to look out for and protect women. And when you have women who are put in danger alongside men, the men are going to be very distracted by that, and they're not going to be able to do their job. That's true certainly in combat, in the military. I believe it would be the same thing in fighting fires. It's certainly true in policing. So whenever there's an acute survival risk and there are men and women together, regardless of the capacity of the woman, the men are going to be unable to perform their duties at 100%. I think that's a psychological reality that we have to contend with, and we can't. I think it's dishonest for anyone to have a conversation that doesn't include those points, and to deny biological reality. I think it does a disservice to professions, occupations, and I think it puts lives at risk. That's my personal opinion from the psychiatric point of view.
No, and I appreciate you sharing that, and the elements that I could take in and learn from are there, and then I can hear my own inner voice with some of the conditioning that goes, yeah, I don't know about that. But then I do see the part of 90% of our job is mental health and dealing with medical calls. And it is nice to have a diverse truck. Not saying that that's what we should hire for and that we should strive to lower standards to have that element. But man, 90% of our calls are not physical, and we do have females that can talk to females. And I think there's some healthy components to it personally, just from being in the field for 20 years. And then I also agree that we should never lower physical standards ever for anything. It's like, that's just ridiculous. And we've definitely had to do that, not just for hiring women. It's just because we also have weak men, which we can start to talk about. And it's because they've been groomed into this idea that adversity is bad and to avoid it. So you definitely see some really intelligent, smart, young, strong men, probably even some of the healthiest I've ever seen, getting hired now because they're so hip to some of the stuff with health and eating right. And they're so much more advanced than I was 20 years ago when it comes to this stuff. But you also see a different culture too that's afraid to work hard and be yelled at. And there's a lot more coddling. So it's a giant mixy mess, and it's a new culture, and we just have to talk openly and honest about it.
Well, if we can remove the lying and the deception and the false premises that are baked into a lot of these arguments for evolutionary change, and actually confront the reality, then we can actually move forward and improve. I think that to a large degree, Americans voted as a referendum on truth. and wanting to actually start to speak honestly about our problems. Because the conversations that have been held in the last 4 years have not been founded on the basis of let's speak what's truthful and honest, even if it leads to disagreement, but rather to conform to an ideological standard and then force that into a reality and then pretend that the reality is something that it's not. You know, taking people out in the street and giving them invisible robes and then telling us that we have to point out that they're not naked, that they actually are clothed. That's really what we've been living the last 4 years. And if you keep doing that, people are going to freeze to death. There's no way to have a conversation that is fruitful if it's based on dishonesty. And that's something that I'd like to see change, because I don't care. Personally, I don't really care if people agree with me. I actually like disagreement because it helps me to challenge my own assumptions. What really troubles me is lying and coercion and bullying in the intellectual realm, because that never, ever leads to anything good, ever. And that's all that we've been doing since 2020. That's 99% of every so-called conversation. And I think more Americans now than 4 years ago are starting to share my view that they're just sick of it and they want to get back to actually talking about what's real so that we can actually do something that is not just, as Obama used to say, hope and change for hope and change's sake, but change for improvement, real improvement.
Yeah, and getting over the idea that you shouldn't be offended. If you're challenging yourself in the colleges or anywhere in life, you should be offended. You're going to get offended, and if you are, that's your problem. It's not the person speaking. So we should start making people take responsibility for the fact that they're the ones that are emotionally drawn to an idea, but they're attacking the individual and not the idea, And so people shut down and they don't want to have the hard conversation about anything. It's like stay in a little thought bubble and try to stay safe. And that's dangerous.
Very dangerous.
Yeah. I'd love to hear what your perspective is on the rise of narcissism, because obviously that's a huge subject, and especially digital narcissism. And there's like the removal of an evolutionary adaptive trait called shame. And I think shame serves as a useful tool, not that we should just go around shaming everybody, but I've seen that you're not allowed to call people out anymore, especially men. Men are becoming weaker when it comes to telling the truth, especially to women or to other men. And it creates this little feedback loop of amplified narcissism. And so everybody keeps doing it because the feedback is more likes, more validation, more response, and we're almost rewarding narcissism in this time. And everybody praises it. So I'm curious what your thoughts are around this rise in narcissism and where it comes from, and what do you think is the mechanism?
I think it affects men and women differently. I see the rise of narcissism in young women in particular as being a really new and powerful toxin and illness. I would say there's really a pandemic of narcissism right now in the young American woman community. And I believe it starts with an inculcation of the values of self-esteem and feeling good about oneself in social media, in schools, in homes from parents. The belief that girls are inherently victimized by men, and that if they feel bad at any point, it's due to someone else aggressing them, as opposed to just the fact that feelings are often uncomfortable. There is a lie, basically, that we've been telling young girls, which is that they can do no wrong, and that their needs should always be met, that they don't need boys, that they don't need men, and that they're completely self-sufficient. I mean, this is essentially the definition of narcissism. It's a preoccupation with oneself, with the belief that one can provide all of one's needs, that there's no sense of community or interdependence, that there's no need for gratitude, that there's no need for apologies, of taking responsibility or accountability. I mean, these are values that are inculcated into young girls today on social media, in schools, and by parents. And they're leading to a really sick, poorly developed young woman who is angry, disillusioned, alone and lonely, unable to find a healthy relationship with a man who is strong and expresses masculinity, it's one of the most destructive movements that I've seen. I think it's even more destructive than the feminist movement. Narcissism is affecting men in a different way. I think that men, largely speaking, are lacking courage today. I think they're lacking strength. I think they're lacking fortitude. I think they are being feminized. I think they are being turned into a poor version of a woman. And this is leading to a new generation of young men who are addicted to video games, online porn, poor physical workout strength, weakness, physical weakness, an inability to essentially contain the emotionality of women. And that emotionality has become completely unhinged and histrionic in the last 4 years. And a fear that if they do stand up and express masculinity, that they're going to be shamed, ostracized, stigmatized, banned, lose their job, perhaps even arrested or have their children taken away from them. So I think that the narcissism in women is largely driving the problem, but I think that the failing of men in general to protect their masculinity is leading to an expansion of the narcissism across all areas of society. So my solution that I propose to this expansion of narcissism includes what I said earlier about just simply getting back to reality, of pointing out the truth. But it must start with, I believe, the parents. And the parents must start to inculcate more traditional values. And I don't mean cleaning and cooking for women. That's not what I mean by values. I mean the values of embracing the feminine and encouraging the masculine through the admiration of the masculine in women. And I think if we were to do that, I think that would go a long way towards containing the histrionics and the narcissism of the girls. It would bring back men to the forefront in their roles in society, which is to produce and to protect. And I think it would make for a much, much happier group of young men and women that would be more content to be together. They would engage more in a loving relationship that would lead to marriage. And then they would end up having children as two-parent households, which is now disappearing from the US.
And do you think this was an orchestrated thing that started in the 60s as well, like the destruction of the feminist, like the actual feminist movement that was there before the hijacking of it and flipped it the other way, just like the traditional liberal values have been flipped on their head? You know, it's like there's this interesting dynamic where it seems like it's socially engineered from my perspective, but I'm always wondering what other people think.
I don't think that the post-war feminist movement was a good movement that was corrupted. I think it was corrupt from the beginning. It was founded on hating men. It was never about helping women. One of the biggest, and I'm not talking about suffragettes, equal voting rights, pre-war, post-war, one of the biggest pushes in the feminist movement was to get women into the workplace, which sounded so superficially nice because it sounds like women now have these choices. They can actually go to the job and they can work and they can make money. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, the result of that is a complete cultural disaster. Wages have declined due to the flood of 50% of the population into the workforce, which leads to, in basic economics, same demand for work, doubling of the supply, wages have stagnated. And so what started out as a choice, a personal choice for women to work, became an economic necessity. And now, even if women don't want to work, they have to, because two-parent households are necessary economically in this country in order to simply live at the level that people lived at in the 1950s when there were primarily single-parent households. So economically, it's been actually a disaster. It's been a disaster for parenting because now we don't have mothers taking care of or rearing their children. They're basically handing them off to daycare centers and nurses and nannies, or schools, which the government, of course, is just ever so happy to receive children from dusk till dawn and feed them and clothe them and course, indoctrinate them. So it's not helping with child rearing either. It's not helping with marital stability. Women are more depressed and more anxious, according to Pew Research reports, in the last 3 years than they have been in the last 75. There's a higher degree of prescriptions for anxiety and depression than ever before in the last 50 years. More women are in therapy. They're not happy. Women are miserable with the lot that they have received from the feminist movement. So it's not helping them emotionally either. And it's also taking its toll on marriage. Divorces keep skyrocketing. The rates are not getting any better. Men and women are not getting married because they see very little modeling of happy marriages, because the women are miserable in the marriage and the men are miserable with them. On every single level, it's been a disaster. Women have not gained anything from the feminist movement. If anything, their lives have been wrecked and destroyed by it, which is why I think we see this new trad wife movement cropping up. Now, I'm not here to support the traditional wife movement. I'm just pointing out that whenever you take a message that sounds good and winds up wrecking a whole group of citizens, a counter movement forms. And the counter movement is now going back to this sort of Little House on the Prairie idyllic life. I don't believe that exists. I don't think it ever existed, but I understand why there's been a 180-degree push against feminism, because it got it wrong. I think women were lied to from the beginning. Freedom does not mean having to go slog off on a workplace job site, lifting lumber or climbing the top in a corporate law firm in order to be a full, free, and fulfilled woman. Very few women enjoy that kind of work. Very, very few. And those that do, they certainly have the right to pursue it. But now women really don't have an option anymore. It's kind of ironic, actually, when the idea of choosing how to live came to the forefront of the feminist movement in the 60s. It sounded like freedom. And now women feel less free than ever. They feel that they have no options. And the goal of, The Life of Julia, that horrible video that Obama pushed during his re-election campaign a number of years ago, showed this poor woman leading her life as a single mother, going to the factory every day, and then ending her career in a retirement home, being paid by the government to stay well. That is not a recipe for happiness, but that is exactly what the feminist movement began, and that's what our government continued.
I agree. Yeah, and it seems like the ability to promote these ideas is more sophisticated now than ever, with social media and corporate media and just sort of glorifying certain elements of the way that a woman should live their life. So I don't think most women or men are aware of a lot of the underlying elements that you articulated, but we all can feel it, and that's why it's useful to hear people that spend the time to write the books and to put into order a lot of these dynamics. And Jordan does a good job with that too. Sometimes he's saying the thing that most people can't say, and that's why we have good writers and good thinkers and people that are able to come to the table, even though they get shut down and censored and demonized for it because it's uncomfortable to the people that have drank the Kool-Aid. But I agree, it seems pretty bad. And it's hard for guys at work that I know to have children. Their wives end up having to work, and then their kids are in the hands of who knows. And it really does become this indoctrination model. And you're like, do we really want that? Do you want your kids to be raised by the government? No, they're in, terrible lit rooms. They're almost in prisons, and they're sitting in 90-degree angles, and they're being programmed all day long, and it's
This
probably
does seem like the end point, doesn't it? I mean, once women are forced to work because they can't survive without it, they have to send their kids to government schools as daycare centers. So the government is basically taking your child because you're not able to take care of your child. You don't have the choice to take care of your own child anymore. This is the most anti-choice movement that one could ever devise. And you're right, it seems very scripted. It seems very intentional, because the end game, the end result of this is for the families to dissolve. And that's what's happening. Our American family structure is dissolving under our eyes.
Yeah. I hope people can start to, I think they are. I think this last election in the last 4 years is helping people to see the underlying symptoms and issues with the government being the big problem here. And people are starting to question. Even a neighbor of mine, I live in a pretty liberal neighborhood because I'm in a city, and people are feeling a little bit of relief in the last few weeks. Even though they may not agree with the figurehead, Donald Trump, I think they're also seeing that the system is broken and that we couldn't have survived another 4 years with the direction we were heading. And the things that he's proposing and speaking about, if you just listen to it, are like, oh, let's get back to some of our core freedoms. And I think we need it more than ever. And I think a lot of the liberal people are going, even if they don't want to speak about it because they're going to be shamed by their friends or by the group, they know it because I've talked to them, and they're good people, and I love both sides. It's not like I'm an ideologue, but I need friends that have liberal values. I have liberal values, but then there's the extremes where people have been pushed into, and I think we're coming back to center, and that's good.
Well, I think that, and this is an important distinction. I'm glad you brought this up. I think it's very, very important. I think it's critical to distinguish between the left and the anti-left, because the left is a very specific group. It's a small number of people. It now includes a lot of non-traditional elitists that were not part of the left in the early 1900s with the Leninist revolution and under Stalin eventually. But it's premised on the same value, which is a sense of elitism. It's now a more inclusive elitism, but it's still elitism. And everything that comes from the left is destructive. There is no exception to that. It's not a question of a thermostat, like too high or too low. It's nuclear. It's inherently destructive. Liberals do not share any of the values with the left. In fact, they share essentially 95, 99% of the values with conservatives. One of the only values they probably don't share is fiscal conservatism. A lot of liberals believe that government has a larger role to play in spending money to help people. That's about it. Otherwise, the values are more or less the same. There's nuances, like you said, there's a little tune up here, a little tune down there, but essentially we're on the same page with the thermostat. And I think that this last election showed that the false division between liberals and conservatives that the left have generated is failing. And liberals are now seeing that they're actually really on the same page with conservatives. That as Elon Musk did when he wrote that little stick figure line drawing about a year or two ago, he showed liberals and conservatives on the number line being like two positions away. And he put me, and he wrote a little stick figure of me, Elon, kind of like in the middle between like number 1 and 3. He was like a number 2 between liberal, conservative. And then he put like the next number line down, which was a year or two later. And he showed this quote unquote liberal position was like -100. And he stayed in the same position, and the conservatives moved slightly over to the left. But the leftists went off the fence. In other words, they pulled the liberal values off the fence with them and over the cliff. And I think that's really been a great deceit that's been very successful with the left, is convincing liberals and conservatives that somehow they're opposed to one another. And they're not. There are 3 ways to vote, or 3 groups of voting. The conservatives vote their values. Conservatives vote their values. The left votes their values. Liberals don't vote their values. Liberals vote for leftists. And finally, in the last election, liberals voted their values and they voted for so-called conservatives, and they voted against the left. And that, to me, is one of the biggest transformations, because I think finally this word game that we've been played with, that somehow we can interplay or interchange the word liberal with left and say, well, the left is just sort of liberals too far to the left. No, it's not. They're fundamentally different. There is no overlap between liberal values and left-wing values. One is inherently destructive, and the other is just sort of pliable and is close to conservatism. I think that's something that people are finally waking up to, that they've been lied to about these terms for a long time.
Yeah, and it's hard for people to know where they stand when they've been conditioned to think a certain way. It's like you got to that's what speaking is so important for. That's why we're able to have that First Amendment. And if you scrub that, like you said, in Europe or North Korea or all these places, you're screwed. Once you take that away, everybody's fucked. There's nobody that can get out once you can't exchange ideas and think freely. And it's unbelievable how far they've gotten. But I think we're in the middle of the transition phase, I hope. you know?
I'm really hoping so too, and I'm hoping from a rational basis, not just like I'm praying for it to be true.
Yeah.
I'm actually seeing it unfolding before my eyes. There's still a lot of people who are terribly conditioned to believe a lie. You see these women online shaving their heads, getting blue tattoos, going on sex strikes to try to protest the patriarchy post-election. There are still people like that, and I think they're mentally ill. I actually think, clinically speaking, they're not well. It's not that I disagree with them. I actually think that they have a mental illness. But fortunately, it seems like those people with the mental illness who make up I would say, the victim class of the left-wing elitists, they're losing a lot of power, and people are not buying into it. They're not influencing people's opinions anymore. They're not convincing normal, healthy people to join them. They're starting to look actually crazy. And normal Americans who used to say that they were part of that group, the people that were, say, supporting gays and lesbians' civil rights, that were glommed on to the transgender movement, are finally saying, whoa, I don't actually see the connection between gay rights and cutting the breasts off of children. Where's the connection here? There's no one step further. Having free rights for people who have same-sex attraction has absolutely nothing in common with mutilating children. There is no there. There's no overlap. And then these people going online, screaming and yelling, wearing dresses with purple hair that want to molest young boys, that say that they're women and they're actually men with, with beards. They're saying, oh, all of you people you're opposed to gay rights. You're transphobic. And they're saying, no, actually, we completely support gay rights. We don't want child molesters going into bathrooms and messing up little girls' bodies. That's finally being said after 4 years of people all thinking it and not being able to say it. Finally, it's coming out. It's like the deluge is now finally broken through the dam. And finally, people are actually comfortable speaking the truth. And that, to me, is a godsend.
Yeah. And in the short term, it doesn't seem like it's going to be enough, but I think even in 2 to 5 years, we're going to see a huge uptick of people just having more real conversations and being able to have the conversations. I should be allowed to vote for who I want to vote for and be vocal about it without losing business or losing neighbors. It's you can tell that the orchestrated effort is to just completely get us pitted against each other to create civil war, really. And it's ideological warfare now, but when it gets to kinetic, or it starts to create migrations, which is what we saw during COVID, everybody's moving to other states because they wanted their kids to be able to go to school, or they didn't want to have to get jabbed, or there's a million other reasons. They didn't want to be taxed to the gills, or I think people want freedom. And that's what I think the underlying thread is. And we need to cling to freedom as the first principle,
Leave me alone. That's what people were saying. Leave me alone. Just start with that.
Yeah.
And then we'll work out how to fund social services and what specific restrictions are placed on police officers' protocols. We can discuss those things, but we have to start with leave me alone. I need to be free. Without that, there's no further conversation that's possible.
Yeah. I want to be respectful of your time because you said you got to go here. So I ask everybody, if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world?
That's a very bleak and dark basis for the question. If I was going to die today,
it helps you to dig into what actually matters if it were true.
Well, I think what I can say about me personally is that I have no regrets for having lived what I see as the most honest, true life that I've been able to do given the circumstances I was in. That I did not sacrifice or sell my beliefs and my values for some form of temporary comfort or protection from the storm. And if all of us were to live that way, I think that would go very, very far towards resolving every one of the problems and challenges that the two of us have brought up today in this conversation.
I love it. That's beautiful. Where can people find you? Where would you like them to find you if they want to find your ideas?
So I now have consolidated just about everything that I speak about, write about, broadcast, record through my website, which is called Dissident MD. Because when you speak dissenting opinions, you become a de facto dissident now in the United States. Hopefully that will change. So dissidentmd.com, dissident doctor essentially, is the compendium and repository for my weekly articles, links to my podcast with Dr. Jeff Barkey, which is called Informed Dissent, the intersection of healthcare and politics, as well as my calendar page where I post and list the events where I'll be speaking at upcoming events. And also where you can look up and purchase my books, which we talked about today, United States of Fear and Freedom from Fear.
Awesome. I appreciate you sharing your time today. It was a really fun conversation, and I love that we could agree on most, and when we disagree, we could still have a conversation. I think people need to learn from that.
I agree.
So, all right. You have a beautiful day, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.